Rory, thank you so much for coming to talk to me today.
Thanks, Charlie. Good to be here.
Excellent. So, first off, let's get straight into it. I've got this feeling that there is an assumption out there that if you work in the field of sustainability, or even if you just are somebody who cares about the planet, that you understand all the jargon that is bandied around out there. And I say some of these words and I think, do I actually know what they mean? So, having you here today, I'm going to use this opportunity to get you to explain these things to me like I am 5. And these things are: what is digital carbon? What are cloud emissions? And what is net zero?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Pressure's on now. So So I guess there's the two kind of groups there. So there's the digital side of things, and then the wider business side of things, which is the net zero targets. So digital carbon is the emissions that are associated with the digital sector as a whole. So quite broad. The cloud computing emissions are those emissions that are directly from cloud computing. So that's when a company is, say, developing a new digital product, or they are hosting and delivering a new product, that kind of thing. So it's the computation that goes on directly within a company. And digital carbon is everything else that surrounds that, so that's like us right now on Zoom, or it's, browsing your phone, that kind of thing. So cloud computing sits within, it's a significant part of, but it sits within digital carbon itself. And net zero is, it's bandied around quite a lot. It seems to be everywhere at the moment. And it's not just relevant for businesses. It's like an idea that anything that kind of exists in the world that's new in the world should not bring any new emissions to the atmosphere. So that could be, for an individual, you could be, if you wanted to be a net zero person, be pretty hard, but you could be, and that would mean that all your activities and things would have no overall contribution to greenhouse gases. And for a company, it means that, their operations, their products, their staff, their offices, everything, just by them existing, they're not adding any emissions to the atmosphere. And you've seen it spreading quite a lot, to have like a net zero event where, all the travel that's associated with the event and whatever artists are there and all that kind of thing is either offset or done in a way that there's no overall emissions, overall like contribution to the atmosphere. So I'm not sure if I'm jumping ahead here, but net zero for companies basically means that you need to measure your emissions. You need to report your emissions, and then you need to work to reduce them, ideally to zero. But we don't live in an ideal world, and it's that, for some companies, depending on industry and what they're doing, it's at this stage going to be almost impossible to go right down to zero just through reductions. For some companies, they can do it. And at that point, the deficit between maximum reductions and overall net zero is where some companies choose to offset or invest in carbon removal, or biodiversity projects, that kind of thing.
So like planting trees, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Planting trees. There's all sorts of different projects and organisations out there that promise to remove that last little bit. But we always say, and I believe that reduction is the most important bit. Otherwise, you're kind of plastering over a problem.
Yeah. So you're talking about reduction. So we're talking net zero. It's all about what we're putting into the atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gases being equal with what we take out. So if we are putting less into the atmosphere, then we have to worry less about what we take out. Is that right? So that's what you mean when you're talking about reducing your emissions?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's say for an SME that, I don't know, makes eco coffee cups, let's say.
Yeah.
If they want to go net zero, they would look at their whole sort of the way that their products are manufactured and marketed and delivery and all this kind of stuff. Calculate what the overall impact of their business is, and including staffing and those kind of operational things as well. Because for some companies that's quite significant. So you calculate what your number is. You then highlight areas where you can make some quite easy reductions. So I don't know, maybe it's like changing your distribution hub to wherever most of your clients are, that kind of thing, just off the top of my head. And then once you've kind of maxed out your reductions, ideally, every year there's going to be more and more feasible ways of reducing all your emissions. Once you've maxed that out, if you want to go the whole way, you then look to kind of offsets. So it's a last resort in a way, but often essential. Yeah.
Now, I've spoken to many businesses over the years, and one of the common, it's becoming less and less because the awareness is getting much better. But I have had many business founders say to me, "Oh, well, we're just online, so that's okay. We're just online, so we don't have very many emissions." And I guess that's the problem with what you're talking about, the digital emissions and what we started talking about, the cloud and digital carbon, is that it's invisible and it's not something you can see. It's not the car that you're driving to work, or like you say, where your distribution center is and where your products are being sent out from. So tell us a bit about Greenpixie, because that's your jam, isn't it? That's what you guys are doing. So how are you guys helping businesses who want to achieve net zero or on their journey towards sustainability to reduce their emissions?
Yeah. So we at Greenpixie, I guess more broadly, like sustainability and all this kind of field or movement, or whatever you kind of want to call it, isn't a static thing, So every year things are improving and developing, and while 5 years ago the idea of a company being purely online would be seen as the ultimate goal, nowadays, even talking like terms of 5 years, it's becoming the norm in a way. So there's companies that don't have and never have had, never will have physical presence, physical product. There's sometimes even there's no travel involved, and everything is done in the cloud, so to speak. And at the moment, it's a bit of a gap in the way things are done, and the digital sector is only going to grow. It's not. I think in it had 5 years again. There's less digital companies out there than there is today. Yeah, I'll eat my hat. And who knows? In 100 years, we have no idea how this field will develop. Like maybe there will be no physical companies, no offices, no physical products. Even like we don't know where this will go. So, seeing as we are still kind of relatively early stage, we believe it's like important to start accounting for the impact that digital has now, because like you said, it's this invisible. I do think there's a lot of like kind of similarities in a way between the digital emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in a way, and the way that like the public understanding of the way climate change happens and the way that emissions affect our environment and our planet, the way that understanding kind of developed. So before perhaps our like great grandparents would see gases, or rather not see gases, going into the atmosphere. And obviously, if you can't see it, it's not an issue, right?
Yeah.
And it takes a while to realize that because the problem's invisible, it doesn't mean it's, doesn't mean it's not important. It often means that actually you need to act now. And that's where we kind of fit in. We're trying to put a lens on digital operations and the digital environment, and let those that need to kind of, I guess, see and have a vision of their real impact, because it is so intangible to some people unless you're really in the industry and you really know how the internet works, which I would hazard to say no one really knows.
No.
There's no expert out there on exactly how the internet works. There's a lot of it's so intricate, and yeah, we're trying to put a lens on that to help companies kind of take account of their emissions. The way we're addressing this issue is developing Cloud Net Zero, which is in development at the moment, and SMEs in particular, would be quite interesting for them to sign up on our website and give the beta version a go in the next month, actually. And what Cloud Net Zero will do is it will allow companies with a heavy digital presence and those that have digital products, that kind of thing, or they have a lot of computation that goes on, or tech heavy companies, it will allow them to equate their cloud server usage with emissions, basically. And companies can do with that data whatever they please. Most companies are interested in terms of incorporating it into their carbon accounting, carbon footprinting. So yeah, that gives companies a baseline. So this year our emissions for cloud computing are X amount, and that then allows them to set targets as part of net zero strategies to bring that figure down over the coming years. It doesn't mean that you need to cut down on how much computation you're doing. It means doing it in a more efficient way. So yeah, that's what we're doing at the moment.
Brilliant. You mentioned their reporting, so I'm going to ask you about a bit more about that. ESG reporting. What is it and why is it important? I've heard it talked about a lot in kind of the investment world, but for smaller businesses, for SMEs, is it something that we should be thinking about, and how do we go about it?
Yeah, ESG is a bit of a weird one. I think I'd if I was going to try and explain ESG, I think I would describe it more as ultimately as a philosophy, as like an idea. And it's like the idea that those with money to invest and those who don't want their money to be invested in particular areas that a lot of us consider to be unethical or controversial, or areas that don't benefit the world as a whole, they need a way of kind of comparing different investments and making informed decisions on where their money should go, and kind of comparing companies against a bit of an industry standard in a way. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So although we're here talking about the environmental, the E, the idea of ESG investing also takes into account the social impact of a company, both internally and externally as well. So diversity within the workforce and in all kinds of ways, and governance is the idea that some companies are mini nations in themselves. So like they need to be governed well and fairly. And the idea is that if they're governed well and fairly, they're going to have a better, a more positive impact on the world. But from the environmental side of things, I would say that the E has become increasingly important. So there's estimates at the moment that by 2025, about a third of all assets under management are going to have some kind of ESG rating, and that sort of market share would actually put ESG funds and ESG companies in a much more powerful position than the fossil fuel industry, which is it's already the case. But by 2025, it's going to be quite a clear and significant shift in terms of like market power in favor of companies which, in theory, have a net positive impact on the planet and on people.
Wow, that's interesting. That's not long to go, and that's really good to hear. I mean, I've written on Earth Collective a lot about investors putting the pressure on big corporations to divest from fossil fuels, and that's been sort of petering away in the background. But it's good to hear that it kind of sounds like it's coming in as a regulatory measure in a wider sense.
Yeah, definitely. There's also like interesting like industry movements as well. You know, like B Corp in a way is a measurement of ESG. It's just a kind of different lens. So that's why I think it's like more of a kind of idea and a kind of philosophy. And when you see ESG funds or like sustainable investing written somewhere, it is just that kind of that concept, that idea that money should be going to good places and not to fossil fuel companies and that kind of thing. And it's also it's agency, you know. So like if you need to, if you're an investor, and we all are in our own kind of ways, we all invest in global economies through what we do. If you are under the impression that your money is going somewhere that has a positive environmental, social impact, you kind of want a guarantee of that, you know. And the idea of ESG is to have a bit of a baseline and a bit of evidence behind those kind of claims.
That's really interesting, and it's interesting you mentioned B Corp, because I think, and I wrote this in the article that we collaborated with Greenpixie on this week, was that, you know, if you Google ESG, it comes up all about investing. And as the layperson or, you know, just a human being existing in the world who doesn't, who either owns a small company that you're never going to want investment from, or who doesn't own a company at all and just works, that can be a bit off-putting, because you think, oh, well, this is something that isn't, you know, that's not for me. That's for startups who are after funding, or it's for, you know, publicly listed companies or whatever it is. But when you put it back to B Corp, like I look for the B Corp, like that. For me, the B Corp, if I see the B Corp logo, say B Corp again, B Corp, if I see the B Corp logo on packaging, like we have Gusto meal delivery boxes, you know, box things, recipe boxes.
Yeah.
And one reason I went with them as opposed to any competitor was because they were a B Corp. So for me, that's like a really easy, as a consumer, a really easy checkbox to say, okay, I know this company is doing good things. And I guess that's what we need to look at ESG reporting as well. Like when you talked about us all being investors, and as a consumer, you're an investor, and as somebody who buys things, you're investing in small businesses, hopefully. So if a small business can show that they have invested in themselves by looking at their ESG reporting, that's another kind of tick box, and that's something that we potentially should be thinking about as consumers as to where we invest our money. Yeah,
it's a really interesting way of like comparing them, actually, like the B Corp and I guess that the B Corp stamp to the consumer is exactly what the ESG stamp is to the investor. It's that kind of okay, I can buy this, I can invest in this
Yeah.
with a clear mind. And yeah, it's an interesting trend. You know, I guess it started with like the Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance, and the B Corp seems to have superseded a lot of them recently.
Has, isn't it? It's a bit more all encompassing. I think it's something we were
Yeah,
waiting for. So I am a business, and I have listened to this this conversation, and I'm sold ESG reporting. I want to get into it. Where do I start, and how do I report it? Am I going to put it all into an Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet? Like, where do we get
yeah,
started?
yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah. If a business asks me how to start, I would say just start. You know, don't let, if you're doing any reporting and any attempts to calculate, particularly as an SME, your emissions, don't let those kind of things hold you back. And I would say just really, there's a lot of resources out there now that can help you. If you're doing it on a spreadsheet or on Google Sheets, or even on with pen and paper, depending on the size of your business, the important thing is that you're doing it. And you know, all roads lead to Rome. There's many ways to skin a cat, but the important thing is that like you're calculating and you're reducing, and I think importantly that you're reporting it as well, so that like your clients and consumers can see that this is your intention, that you're taking action. There's been a huge boom recently in softwares to help companies do this. Some better than others, some more expensive than others. But I think as an SME, that's what you can do off your own back. And again, depending on the size of the business, there's no reason why you should go out there and spend a huge amount to calculate. But yeah, it just depends how much time you have, I guess. For bigger companies, it's obviously a whole of the ball game, and it takes whole departments of experts to calculate things. And where we kind of fit into that is taking, I guess, what is now like one of the hardest things to calculate for a company, which is your digital emissions and your cloud emissions, and turning it into like the easiest part of it. So really, yeah, it's ultimately, I would say just start doing it and take advantage of all the resources you can, particularly as an SME. There's often ways of doing things and obtaining like softwares and tools and guides and stuff. Yeah, without some of the sometimes like eye-watering figures that big businesses have to contend with. And also like just chat to other people that are doing it. That's one of the best ways. I think if you're having a problem like footprinting the label you're using, I think in this kind of community, in this kind of sector, there's no issue with reaching out to another brand or another company that's using, particularly for SMEs, using perhaps the same label or a similar label, and just saying like, you know, are you calculating it? How did you, perhaps we can work it out together, that kind of thing. So yeah, just start today, because it'll take a while.
So what they say, the best time to plant a tree was 50 years ago. The second best time is today. So it's the same thing. Just get started.
Yeah. And plant trees.
And plant trees. That's a great segue. I was literally just going to ask you about that. So lots of businesses do plant trees, or they, like you say, spend money with an organization or a charity that is going to offset carbon emissions for them. We've spoken a lot about reducing the emissions we're putting out there in the first place, and how digital carbon is a really good area to be looking at, and cloud emissions. Is it still impactful to be planting trees with every purchase, or, you know, offsetting your travel emissions through a charity? Is it still worth doing those things?
Yeah, that comes up. It comes up a lot, and it's it's becoming quite controversial, isn't it? Really, like the idea of planting trees and that kind of thing. Whereas that was not that long ago, that was the kind of gold standard of that was the most a company could be doing in a way, was planting trees. I think like we don't offer that as a service, like not because we disagree with it at all, but more because that's the choice of a company to do that, or a person. I don't think I've seen arguments around, and like people really slamming like tree planting and biodiversity projects and stuff, which I do find a little bit hard to agree with, because planting a tree, although it might not be the best thing in the world, it's definitely not like a negative if it's done right. Like, and there are a lot of organizations and projects and things that do great stuff. So there's like Gold Standard is one organization, and they have like verified projects, and I think as well, carbon removal is perhaps like the latest iteration of that idea of offsetting and tree planting. And yeah, again, it can be a great option for companies, but they don't always come with some of the other like intangible benefits, environmental benefits of stuff like tree planting, which is like the biodiversity side of things. Often there's like social benefits attached to it as well. So really, I think if I had a big carbon footprint as a company to reduce, I'd obviously start there and reduce it all the way to zero as far as I could. And if I had a gap, a little debt at the end, I would probably have a kind of portfolio and combine both approaches, so removals and offsets. And the worst thing that happens is you do a bit too much, and that's fine.
Yeah,
because I'm sure there's companies out there that aren't doing enough. So you can't go wrong really. I mean, I wouldn't get too bogged down in the complexities of whether it's right or wrong to plant a tree and do it, and it's super cheap now as well, so why not?
I agree. I mean, I think it comes down to everything, isn't it? Do your research and make sure that where your investment is going in all of these cases is going to somewhere where it's going to be used in the right way for the right purpose, and it's helping the right people and the planet as well. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, definitely.
Another piece of the jargon puzzle of all this net zero, carbon emissions, all that stuff, is scope 1, 2, and 3. So can you explain a little bit more about what these are?
Yeah. I think it takes everyone a long time to get their head around it, and potentially no one ever quite fully understands it. It's quite an intricate, well, in some ways very simple, in some ways very kind of complicated and confusing framework. So it's basically the concept of breaking down a company's emissions into different portions or scopes or segments. And it stems from something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is an international agreement that has sought to standardize the way things are done. So if you go and do, read around this after, or have read around this before, it's often shortened to GHGP or the GHG protocol. And it's by far the most common method of reporting for companies. For those companies that do report, this is the most common method. I think it's something like between 80 and 90% of companies that report use this framework. And the scoping of emissions accounts rather for like the varying degrees of control that a company has over those emissions. So direct and indirect. I think I find, for myself anyway, the best way to kind of imagine them is to break them down into kind of the context of your own like personal life, rather than trying to imagine how a company operates, and like, because they're all so different. And yeah, that used to really confuse me. So you have scope 1, which is like direct emissions.
Mm-hmm.
Scope 2 is indirect emissions, specifically from purchased energy.
Okay.
And scope 3 is all other indirect emissions from sources that aren't owned or controlled by a company. So scope 1, if you think about we think of scope 1 as being everything that you directly emit from inside your house.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the perfect example would be if you have a fireplace,
Right.
and you put wood on the fire. That's a scope 1 emission. You have total control over that. You're choosing to burn wood in your house to generate warmth, and your emissions from your car as well would fall under this. And for a company, that would equate to like if you have delivery vehicles or fleet vehicles, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Scope 2 is the indirect purchase of electricity or energy by a company. So like, I guess using the same analogy again, if you don't have a fireplace but you've got like an electric heater or something, or if you're someone that's not England, maybe some electrical air conditioning, that would be scope 2, because you're using energy that's been produced somewhere else to perform an activity. Gotcha. But an important like distinction, which I think separates scope 1 and 2 quite well, is like so let's say like the air conditioning was to leak its coolant fluid on your property, on the wall of your house. That has quite a significant greenhouse gas impact, like the chemicals and things that are used within air conditioning. So that leakage, like on your property, like on your watch, that's scope 1, because you have control and the power to stop that from happening. Whereas the electricity that's used to power the air conditioning is scope 2, because you can't necessarily control how that electricity is made, but you can ensure that your aircon doesn't leak, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's a good way of describing it.
Yeah, I think so. It might sound, maybe, I hope that makes sense.
It does. It was really good.
And scope 3 is the indirect, uncontrolled and like unowned, if unowned is a word, unowned emissions of a company. So this is like the emissions that stem from the manufacture of your air conditioning unit or your fireplace, or the emissions associated with growing the wood that you burn in your fireplace. And it's the largest scope in terms of emissions. There's all kinds of varying figures that get bandied around as to how much percentage of a company's overall emissions this accounts for. But yeah, I've heard anywhere up to kind of 90% for a company. And this is also where digital carbon falls for most companies. It's a bit it's where the consensus is that you should be accounting for digital is in scope 3, even though I think and we think it's a bit more complicated than that, as it's a non-physical thing. It kind of sits across all of them in a way. But yeah, it's been like the source or the focus of quite a lot of debate amongst companies, because there's some that obviously don't want to open that Pandora's box of calculating scope 3 emissions, and there's some that go above and beyond that do. It's becoming increasingly normalized to do that, and there's growing like legislative movements as well that are mandating scope 3 for some companies depending on size. So it's the SFDR, which you can look up in the EU, and the SDR in the UK, and the US is also making movements to kind of mandate scope 3, which I think within the next few years we'll kind of wonder why that was never the norm. So yeah, that's the kind of idea of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. I think if you ask someone else to explain it, they'd have a totally different way of imagining it, but it's designed to like be applicable to all companies, so like that's why it is quite broad in a way, and it can be interpreted differently, and there's no fine line between all of them. It's just a method and a framework that any company could pick up and use to calculate their emissions.
That's a great way to end our chat today. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rory.
Thank you. That's been great. Thank you for having me on. Great to chat. I'll be back.
Excellent.